Well, following the explosive media briefing by U.S. Ambassador to South Africa, Reuben E. Brigety, on Thursday, government has not definitively responded to the allegations. Brigety said U.S. intelligence has hard evidence that South Africa sold arms to Russia during the SA-Russia naval exercises in December last year. When leader of the opposition, John Steenhuisen, asked President Cyril Ramaphosa about the matter during a Q&A session in Parliament, the president said there is nothing of this nature to his knowledge. Washington says it's still committed to bilateral relations with South Africa. And International Relations Minister Naledi Pandor met U.S. Ambassador Brigety yesterday. A DIRCO spokesperson alleges that he apologized unreservedly despite there being no evidence of such an apology. Well, let's get some analysis now on these developments with the director of the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Pretoria, Professor Christopher Isike. Prof, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us on the Weekend Report.
Good morning, and thank you for having me on your show.
Well, in the last 24 hours, we've had DIRCO issue a démarche to the ambassador. We've had the ambassador himself tweet a response saying that he was given an opportunity to correct any misimpressions that may have been made by his public remarks. What do you make of this latest turn in events? Is it an indicator that things are on the upward trajectory?
Well, yes, they have always maintained that the relations between both countries was strong. It's a good thing that this has been resolved very quickly within 24 hours, if you may. But I think that it was a calculated risk that was taken by the ambassador, and I think that he has achieved his objective, or the objective of the United States in this matter. And so we move on, but the message has been sent. That's my opinion.
What would be the ambassador's objective? Because this was certainly at the heart of a lot of criticism directed at the ambassador to say, surely, there were diplomatic channels that he could have used to air some of his grievances and concerns. Why this public spectacle of airing his concerns? Why do it this way?
Yeah, that's why I said that I think that it was a calculated risk, because these talks are not new. These allegations have been on, and they've been discussing them. Both governments have been talking about them, and that's why the president was also peeved in Parliament, disappointed about not following these channels. And I think that was also the crux of the discussion between Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor and Foreign Secretary Blinken. But look, the going to the public was a calculated risk. It has two objectives, two possible fallouts. One is to ramp up support for those who think that South Africa may not be taking a neutral stance, maybe too pro-Russia in its dealings with this matter. And then also the risk of ostracizing anyone who was on the fence and those who already think that the U.S. tends to bully its partner nations. But I think that the idea on the part of the ambassador, on the part of the U.S., was to place South Africa on alert to say we can escalate responses, we can escalate retributions or actions against you if you do not really take the issues of that we are concerned about concerning Russia as seriously as we want you to. And this would include, the issue of having him in South Africa for the BRICS conference, the question of arresting him, and then a reminder to the South African public that the United States does more for South Africa than Russia, and that if South Africa undermines this, there could be fallout, and a way of alerting the public or prepare the public rather for an explanation of why the U.S. may take actions against South Africa in the future, should South Africa not do what is expected of it as a responsible citizen of the world.
Right. You say that this was a calculated risk. And, we've had a number of criticisms directed at the ambassador saying, it was a bit of an overreach. And it's not the first time we've seen the U.S. with use of its intelligence, issue statements or make public statements in South Africa without the knowledge of the South African government. I mean, last year we had the Sandton terror alert, and we had an instance where the South African government came out to say, well, we had no knowledge of this. Why would the U.S. not share this information with the South African government first before issuing the advisory? How do you interpret that sort of diplomatic relationship where you often have another country, one who has a lot of power when we look at the geopolitical West, repeatedly sort of not following proper channels of communicating in another sovereign state?
Well, you already answered the question yourself when you talk about the power relations there. It's part of the issue around coloniality of power, between the United States and countries in Africa. And by the way, the U.S. does this a lot to other countries of the world, not just South Africa. They've entered countries, actually undertook rescue operations of their citizens or protect their interests without informing the courtesy of informing even the president of these countries. So it's not new. It's what they do, and it's embedded in the coloniality of power that the U.S. has when dealing with countries of the global south. And that's a problem because it speaks to disrespect and contravenes the avowed commitment of equal partnership in its relations, especially with Africa. However, I think that it's a good thing that South Africa took quick steps to try and address that. You would notice that the whole talk from DECO and even the presidency was more about, since Thursday, after he gave that press conference, was more about, not following proper channels and possibly even exploring possibility of reprimanding the ambassador. And this can happen, South Africa could reprimand the ambassador. So that it did it very quickly. The ambassadors apologized, even though he knew exactly what he was doing. Is a good thing for both countries. I think that South Africa remains important to the United States, and even in resolving Russia's war in Ukraine. So I think that we're happy that this has been quickly put behind us, and we must then focus on what the issues are going forward.
Right. Talking about those power relations, they're likely to come into play again, Prof, when we look at the African Growth and Opportunities Act, AGOA. This was something that was cited even by the ambassador during that briefing to say that, the U.S. has supplied all this generosity and goodwill to South Africa, and this issue around the non-alignment and South Africa not necessarily walking its talk is something that's quite concerning and upsetting to the U.S. Have the latest developments in any way jeopardized AGOA from your perspective?
Well, it's cool, and like I said, part of what the ambassador was doing was to remind not just the government but South Africans that the U.S. does a lot. Because remember also that the South African government, especially the ruling party, the ANC, are also goaded by a bit of public opinion, and there's a lot of anti-West sentiments in not just in South Africa but in Africa broadly, which the U.S. takes short for on behalf of the West, because it's seen as the face of the West all over the global South, especially in Africa. So putting AGOA on the table was to remind South Africa that these are the things that we do for you. So when you talk about ties, you talk about relationships, you talk about benefits, and in a realist terms, you should think very carefully about how you deal with this matter. And I think that that's an appropriate thing to do. It's a considerate thing to do, because, like I always said, South Africa's bread right now is better buttered by the U.S. Than Russia. But that doesn't mean that South Africa should completely do the bidding of the United States and not consider whatever relationship it has with Russia. And talking about relationship, it shouldn't just be a relationship with Russia. should be its relationship, its friendship and solidarity ties with Russia are rooted in those ties that were established between the ANC and the Soviet Union, which Ukraine was a big part of, right? So South Africa, this is the reason why South Africa should actually play a passive neutrality in this conflict, because it has an interest to make sure that both Ukraine and Russia benefit from whatever settlement arrangements that South Africa can be part of. And South Africa does have a pathway to be part of that settlement, not just aside its relationship with both countries. And that pathway is through BRICS. So all of these are things that the U.S. put into consideration. To answer your question more directly, I doubt that the AGOA would be ultimately affected. However, let's not also forget that the AGOA is for countries that are developing. South Africa is not quite among the list of these countries. South Africa is more well off than most of these countries that are in the categories that are supposed to be benefiting. So by 2025, when the current AGOA extension ends, South Africa may, for good reasons, besides what is happening currently, not necessarily be included in the list because of its economic status. The US could leave it there as part of a carrot approach to trying to get South Africa to do its bidding on the Russian issue. But it's just something that they are putting on the table to remind South Africans that we are currently doing more for you than Russia is doing. So think carefully about that.
Right. Professor, very quickly, because we have run out of time, it does appear that diplomacy has won for now. We know that an independent inquiry has been set up to look into these allegations. And so, this story further down the line may open up another can of worms for South Africa if indeed it does turn out to be true that arms or a consignment of arms was in fact placed on that Lady R vessel. What then for relations with the U.S. and South Africa if it does indeed turn out that this kind of assistance was given to Russia?
Well, it will not be very good for South Africa, not just in its relationship with the U.S., but also Europe and the rest of the world when you look at South Africa's soft power placement in the world. Remember, when we talk about the United States and what it can do to South Africa, it's not just the United States, it's also the EU and its partners, the U.S. partners, right? So that's part of the deal. But for me, the concern is why we even need an inquiry into these kinds of matter. The fact that the president is not able to clearly deny and say this did not happen, and that you need a panel of inquiry is indicting of the capability of the South African state, to know what happens in his backyard, especially the president. I mean, the president can pick up his phone and call the Minister of Defense to say what happened there. If the Minister of Defense doesn't know and there has to be an inquiry, it tells us something about the porousness and the security architecture of South Africa. So these are things that do not actually need an inquiry. These are things that we should be constantly, and we should have ready answers for. So it's either you're going to say, well, there were exchanges on the day when that Lady R ship docked, but they were not weapons. Or when you say we do not know, we have to do an inquiry, it means that you're not fully in charge. And this is where we then have leverage about saying, well, we provided intelligence and this is what was given you, although the South African government say there is no evidence as to that to confirm that allegation. But this is problematic. This is really problematic that we do not know. We have to have an inquiry. We do not have to have an inquiry. There are people in government who should be checking these things and knowing these things and providing instant answers to make the government's position much more stronger than depending on an inquiry, which will take years.
Indeed. Professor, thank you so much for your insights and for coming on to our program this morning. That was Director of the African Center for the Study of the United States, Professor Christopher Isike. It's time now to